Hello, I am Jackie McCarville, a regional dairy educator for Grant Green, Iowa, and Lafayette counties. And I want to welcome you to our Dairy Margin Coverage 2024 sign up update. Our speaker today is Leonard Polzin, who serves as our dairy markets and policy outreach specialist. Leonard grew up in a century old Wisconsin dairy farm. He has held positions in both the public and private sectors and takes pleasure in applying research to industry scenarios. With considerable experience as an educator and analyst, he has developed and delivered programs covering a wide range of topics, including market analysis, outlook, market expectations, risk management. And if you have questions today, we have a Q&A feature down in the bottom. You can pop any question into there and we will have Leonard take them either at the end, or if it seems relevant, we might stop him and ask that question at that time. So with that, Leonard, it is all yours.
Perfect. Well, sounds good. Yeah, and as we go along, if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in. Happy to answer them as we go along. So one thing that I do ask is, for those of you either watching this live or in the recording, both, please, if you're willing, take and scan the QR code. It'll take you to an evaluation. The big thing for this is that as you get to the bottom, it gives you a chance to ask questions on things that are of interest to you, right? So if there's a topic of research or some questions, maybe even not specifically to DMC, but maybe on a broader range of things related to the dairy industry at the moment, gives you the chance to ask those questions. And we do use that as we kind of plan our work out and kind of take a look at how we want to allocate research and things like this. So I do encourage you to take a look and kind of go through that. So with that, kind of the outline for today is we're going to talk about risk management kind of in general, right? High level approach, all the different options, and then kind of take a look at what is new for DMC and how that kind of fits into your risk management strategy in general. So we'll take a look at historic performance of DMC, current forecast, go through the web tool, answer some questions, things like this. So the big takeaway here, you have until April 29th in order to register or sign up for DMC. So that happens at the FSA office. So that's kind of the big thing takeaway here is April 29th at the FSA office. Now, I think not to give away the end right from the beginning here, but I think it will kind of help to add some context. So when DMC, normally our DMC enrollment happens in the fall, right? Well, this year, since we came to the end of a farm bill cycle and nothing happened and a farm bill wasn't passed in the regular amount of time, right? Then what happened is DMC received an extension, right? So that extension is basically a continuation of the previous farm bill through this enrollment period, which is this calendar year, right? So the calendar year for 2024. So what does that mean for you? It means that when you enroll for 2024, your payment, if you were already enrolled, right, in the previous year, and you enroll again, retroactively, it will go back to January. So, and we did trigger a payment in January. So retroactively, we'd go back to January and trigger that payment. You'd receive that. But also, there's no real, let's say, we'll talk about some of the changes for this year, but there's no real what I would say, substantive changes in this enrollment period. So it's more or less a continuation of the previous program and the program that was in place in last year. So premiums haven't changed, coverage levels haven't changed. It's still your 5 million pounds, all of these things, right? So we're just continuing for another 12-month period. And then once a different farm bill goes through, then we'd be looking at if there's any changes happening at that time. But for right now, for this enrollment period, for this, this coverage period, it's exactly the same as what it was last year. So I shouldn't say that. It's not exactly the same, but there's some small tweaks, and we'll talk about those, but more or less, effectively, it is pretty much the exact same as it was last year. So let's just kind of talk some risk management things in general, right? One thing I like to say is that, so I'm not a big proponent that everybody should always do something. I don't know if that's always the best case, right? So with that, at the very top here is do nothing. I do think it's important to realize that by doing nothing, you are making a decision, right? Like it's easy to sit on the sidelines and never do anything, but that is a decision, right? So sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it isn't. So just to point out again, that is an option, or that is a choice that a producer could make, or self-insure, if you will, right? So if you have a whole bunch of equity on your balance sheet and you have, a lot of money in operating still as well, maybe self-insuring or choosing not to do something would be a good choice for you, right? That's just an example. Would I say that I'd maybe endorse that option? Probably not, but it depends on each individual situation. So other choices, we have futures and options. So for example, your class 3, class 4 futures options, taking positions in the market that way. Cash contracts with your co-op or your plant. DRP, dairy revenue protection. So which is kind of the underlying on that is your futures market as well. LGM dairy, again, underlying is a futures market, but that's livestock gross margin for dairy cattle. And then finally, the one we're going to talk about today is dairy margin coverage, or DMC, which is the old revised MPP dairy. So let's just talk about the futures market a little bit, because a lot of the information that's used in these tools, right? DRP, LGM dairy, even DMC, a lot of the underlying information comes from the futures market, right? So, in these, when you participate in the programs, you're not the individual that's taking the position in the futures market, right? I guess maybe theoretically you could argue that, but for the sake of application, you're not, right? But the information that's used to inform a lot of these programs is coming from the futures market. So let's kind of just create a base understanding of what that is for the moment. So futures markets are, or any market for that case, is a clearinghouse for information, right? It takes into account everything that's going on at the moment, and then tries to, between buying and selling and exchanging, right? These different derivatives, trying to arrive at a price that considers all these different potential outcomes, right? So it's a big sponge for weather events, for things that are happening politically, the general economy, changes in production, changes in the rest of the world, what's happening there, kind of bringing it all together and then trying to arrive at some price for a particular point in time. So what do? They transfer risk for producers. They transfer risk for hedgers as well, right? So you can offset your production risks or some of your price risk there. They do provide a profit motive for speculators if they're willing to accept the risk. And they provide price discovery for the rest of us, which is kind of, what we talked about at the top of the slide here, where we say that, a lot of these programs use the futures market to inform. That's a big kind of how some of that price transfer happens. So futures market will be wrong about price, right? Because there's no crystal ball that says, 3 months from now, class 3 is let's say $20, right? There's no crystal ball that's going to say when we get to that point in time that it's still going to be $20, right? So, as we get closer to expiration, then the futures markets and market prices become more and more accurate, right? But as we go farther out, it is increasingly difficult to predict the future, right? So the further out you go, the more variance we see in that convergence of price, right? So the big takeaway there is that, as you go further out, when you use some of these risk management tools, that's often why the price is more expensive, because you're paying for the volatility, you're paying for the time, the time in between today and further out. that has opportunity cost, right? So as you go further out, you're paying for all these things that are kind of built into the market that says, if somebody on the opposite side of that transaction is going to take that risk, this is what they need to receive in order to take that risk, right? So as you go further out, that price goes up. And that means that sometimes some of these products or some of these choices in risk management can get increasingly expensive. So options are another derivative product within the futures market, and they provide the right, but not necessarily the obligation to deliver, but the right to own the underlying futures contract at a specified price. So there's futures, there's options. So first easy way to think of it is like this is the the first initial paper contract on it, and then the option is the second. And then as they move, and as you take a look at both of them at the same time, you can kind of collectively get additional information about the larger marketplace that we're operating in. So with that, let's talk about some just general considerations for risk management, right? So when you do decide to take some sort of proactive approach and do some type of risk management, it's always important to know what that is, right? That could be anything from insurance products, right, to our futures contracts, LGM, dairy, DMC, all these things. So oftentimes the different things that we are trying to protect are either our production, our price, or our market. Protecting financial risk, institution risk, or human and personnel risk, right? For the sake of today in DMC, what are we looking at? We're protecting its margin. So an income minus an expense to give us a margin, right? So when the different tools that we have to take a look at, this sort of margin type production, if we're going to arrive at them on our own, right? Some ways that we can do that is if we take income minus expense to get margin. On the income side, we can use futures and options, right? So class 3, for example, class 4 contracts for dairy. And then if you were going to use futures and options for your expense side, you could do the exact same thing. You can use, corn, soybean meal, figure out your feed equivalents, and then do, create your own margin type product through utilizing futures and options, right? Because you have your income and your expense and create and figure out your margin, right? It's perfectly reasonable, and people have done that before in order to achieve the same sort of thing. Dairy DRP, dairy revenue protection, that's an income side sort of product, right? So it's the change in your milk price, not necessarily taking into account your expenses. Also on the income side is milk contracts. So if you have, forward contracts with your dairy, something like this, again, that's on the income side. So expenses, we talked about the futures and options, but if you're going to look at contracts, right, you can lock in some contracts for your feed costs, things of the like. But then, as we get to the end and talk about margin, really our main choices are, again, either that futures and options to come up with your margin that way, LGM dairy, livestock gross margin dairy, and then finally the product we're here today for, dairy margin coverage. So I would say that if you take a look at kind of across the board on a lot of your choices here, I do think there's quite a few compelling reasons why someone would want to consider dairy margin coverage. And I think ease and simplicity is definitely a big one. Like if you're taking futures and options positions in order to create your margin, you have to actively monitor that, make sure your time horizons are, lining up. There's, you're going to have margin, but that, I mean, market margin, right, that you're going to have to hold in your account. So that way, if the market moves against you, you can cover that. There's, like I say, just, more time and attention that has to be placed on that. Dairy margin coverage, you go to your FSA office, you go in, you sign up, just kind of set it and forget it sort of thing, right? The, FSA takes care of, when payments are triggered, sending out payments, all of these sorts of things, right? So I do think that not only for simplicity, but also price, I think is a fairly good deal for producers too. So if you look at the cost per hundredweight of DMC versus some other products, I think we're really quite price competitive, especially in that first 5 million pounds of production. So again, we talked about this a little bit, but April 29th, if you walk away with nothing else from this today, I want to make sure you walk away with that. April 29th, make sure you sign up before that date. So dairy margin coverage, again, the mechanics are same as last year. It's your milk price less the value of the feed ration. I have got asked this before, well, how do they figure the ration? Well, it's the amount to produce 100 pounds of milk, right? So I know that there's no ration that perfectly fits everybody's farm, and everybody's ration is different, but it's trying to take those feed equivalents of fat, protein, carbohydrates, appropriate amount of energy, all these things, and then back calculating them out in order to find that ration for 100 pounds of milk. So the milk price is the national average milk price, also known as the all milk price. And so that's what they use for, your income or your revenue side is all milk price. And then feed price is the expense. And then what you're left with is that margin. So when you do go to make a selection on what you want to, when you go make selections to enroll in the program, you have two things to consider. The first is the percent coverage, right? So you can cover 5 to 95% of your historic production level. We'll see in a second here that most people choose about 95%, or the maximum amount of their previous historic production that they can. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is your coverage level, right? So if you want anywhere from $4 per hundredweight all the way up to $9.50 per hundredweight of margin coverage. So we'll see here too in just a little bit, but most of the time people do select those higher coverage levels for sure. So it drops off fairly quickly in enrollments as you get to those lower coverage levels. So again, we still have the two-tier system. We have tier 1, which is your first 5 million pounds of production, annual production, and then tier 2, which is everything greater than that first 5 million pounds. In both of these, you do select your margin coverage levels. Again, for tier 1, it's between $4 and $9.50 per hundredweight. For tier 2, it's between $4 and $8 per hundredweight of margin. And the premiums, again, they haven't changed, but it's for tier 1 between 0 and 15 cents. And tier 2, the premium is between 0 and $1.81 right? So again, more or less the same as last year. So the biggest change this year is the way that historic production history is being stated in sign up. So where before we had our previous production history and supplemental. Well, going forward for this year, they just kind of put them together, and then they have they're just calling that your production history, right? If you do have new supplemental production history you want to include that you have not previously, talk to FSA office, that is possible. But before, they kind of handled these two things separately, like paperwork wise, as far as your established production history and your supplemental. Now they're just kind of rolling them into one. So I hope there's not too much confusion out there, because it's easy to complicate things, but more or less that's the way it's being handled at the moment. They still have the lock-in extension. So if you do that, you do get a discount on your premiums. And the multi-year contract does extend through this period as well. So if you're interested, it probably would be not a terrible idea to take a look at doing that lock-in contract, because if you haven't done so already, I do believe that you would get that discount even if it's a 1-year lock-in period. Premium rates, exactly the same. Enrollment period, again, coming up quick. So make sure that we're stopping into our FSA office to get signed up for this year. Again, for 2024, premium rates is standard, same thing. And if you're choosing not to enroll, that's your choice and you don't need to stop by the office then. But I think it's still a pretty good product. And I think it's fairly wise for folks to consider signing up, that's for sure. So let's just take a look at where 2023 was and kind of what happened there. And I think it kind of gives a good representation of, in a bad year, what type of benefit can be received from utilizing this product, right? So last year there was 17,000 operations enrolled in DMC. And in total, there was like $1.3 billion in payments, and that comes out to approximately $75,753 per operation paid. So with a pretty good enrollment rate of 75%. So when we take a look at our DMC payments and our dairy operations enrolled, Wisconsin, we do historically have very good enrollment. And we did definitely see quite a bit of payout here as well. What I think is interesting is if you take a look at California, they did have some pretty good DMC payouts. And when you take a look at the dairy operations enrolled, you do kind of see that gap there. Well, one reason for that is farm size, right? So, as you get, above that first $5 million pounds, but if you had some production enrolled in some tier 2 production as well. We definitely triggered quite a few of that over the last year. So, as we have been going along, we've been seeing some pretty good payouts here across the US. Again, this pretty much is the same sort of thing, estimated average payouts by state. So, we said that it was 75,000 across the entire US, but if you kind of break that out by state, you can kind of see some of these bigger payouts. Some of this would be, larger farms per average, right? That would kind of drive some of that up as we kind of go down the chart. So, but even still, 50,000+ was not unheard of on a state average, that's for sure. So, when we take a look at enrollments for Wisconsin and even across the US, so we're at above 75% of established production history enrolled last year. This year we're going to hit that again. There's some folks that have, for religious reasons, decide not to enroll or utilize the different programs. But if you kind of take that group out, for Wisconsin, we're very close to that 100% enrollment for with dairy operations with that established production history. So, there's been very big utilization of the program, and I think part of that is seeing that there's been quite a bit of benefit for producers too when they've come across years that aren't so positive in margin. So when we take a look at established production history for tier 1, this is just in pounds to kind of take a look at how different states are utilizing the program. No surprise, Wisconsin has been pretty big utilizer, followed by New York, Pennsylvania. And the second one here is California. So we're getting some, quite a bit of pounds enrolled in the program as we go along. I wanted to include this just to kind of show you where different coverage levels have been signed up at, right? So once we get past that 950, especially in that tier 1, we do see quite a bit of a drop off in our pounds enrolled at our lower production levels, at our lower margin levels. So, which isn't a surprise, right? So, I think a lot of folks choose that 950 margin level. I do think it's a a good argument to be made for choosing that coverage level. But we are seeing folks use some of these lower coverage or lower margin levels as they go along, but which I do find kind of interesting. And if we take a look at tier 2, we even have I'd say a fair bit of coverage there as well. But again, as you go down, kind of fewer and fewer pounds enrolled too. So I do want to go through some of the historic prices here just to kind of get grounding in where we are today and thinking about how we want to maybe proceed with enrollment and some considerations when you do decide to go to the FSA office here. Let's take a look at just all milk price, which is that yellow line at the very top. So this goes all the way back from 2021 all the way through 2024. And as you see, if you start at 2021, we've been below that $20 mark, and then we went way above and then quite a bit back below again, right? And as that all milk price continued to drop, that's when, especially during 2023 here, that's when we saw a lot of hurt when it came to margin on the dairy farm. And as that came down, our margins decreased. Our feed costs were quite a bit higher than they are now too. So that's when a lot of the program payments kicked in. Now, one of the big things here as we look at 2024, our all milk price has come back up some. We're still kind of hovering around that $20 mark, but our feed costs have come down quite a bit. So when we take a look at changes in our margin triggers, right, or changes in how when we're going to be receiving payments, some of that is milk price, of course, but a decent bit at the moment is just that change in feed price. So I know that on the farm level, that maybe not translate perfectly into the way finances work there, right? Because if you have a lot of homegrown feed, if you're not purchasing feed regularly, there may be some discrepancy there. I fully understand that, but that's the way the DMC program is set up to operate. And even so, I do think that it does a fairly good job of trying to capture at least some of those changes in market prices that do affect us at the farm level, that hopefully will still offer some adequate level of protection. So and just to kind of dive into that feed cost again, right? Especially corn. If you take a look at that blue line there, it just has really dropped off recently. Soybean meal is coming down as well. So as this continues to happen, or not, right? It will be kind of the big discussion on the forecast. So I've been asked that question a fair bit recently is, hey, it doesn't look like we're having any forecasted payments. Why should I sign up? And this is a big reason that I would say, hey, maybe you'd want to consider, because, we have seen corn prices fairly low in the past, but there's no guarantee that they're going to keep going down or they could very well come back up again too, right? It's not uncommon to have weather events, things like this that spike some of that up. And if milk prices continue to have additional down pressure here, there's still, I'd say, a not unrealistic chance of having some of these payments triggered over the next 12 months for sure. So let's just take a look at the forecast here. This red line is the forecast itself, and as it gets dashed, that's the red line is the DMC margin itself, and the dashed part is the forecast part. So again, just like we were saying, it looks like we're not anticipated to have any payment triggers, through the rest of the forecasted period. But like I say, you never know. I know it's kind of played out in an adage that I'm sure people are kind of sick of hearing, but you don't buy car insurance with the hope that you're going to use it, right? So kind of the same thing here is in my mind when I'm looking at this, what's the most affordable, most comprehensive sort of risk protection that I have in front of me at the moment, and how does that fit into my risk management strategy, considering all the different tools and all of these additional things, right? How does this fit in? So, another way to think about it is crop insurance, right? I know that, every single year when you buy crop insurance, you don't necessarily hope that you're going to use it, right? So, same sort of thing. Let's talk about payment triggers for a moment. So when we take a look at where our forecast is right now, and if we take a $9.50 per hundredweight coverage level, if we say, all right, if that's our coverage level and this is the forecast, where does milk price have to be in order to trigger a payment? So the red is that milk price trigger, and the yellow is the all milk price. So especially here, if you look in January, we already know that we triggered a payment, right? So that means that red would be taller than the yellow. In February here, we're pretty close to equal. So, very tight there. And in March, the all milk price is just barely above our milk trigger price. And as we go through, especially to May, June, July, we start to widen out a little bit. But I would say that as we're kind of going along here, we're still fairly tight, right? There's not, I wouldn't say there's an immense amount of wiggle room in between those two. And I think it's not unrealistic that we could see, something triggered again this year for sure. So this kind of shows that same thing again of how, if we take a look at where our feed cost is, we add in that margin, our milk price trigger is that red line, the payment, right, is that orange that we already triggered in January. And like I say, as we go along, that does seem to widen. But I know that I believe in the last 2 or 3 enrollment periods, at least, when we did look at forecasts for enrollment, at that time, it's not uncommon to have a good portion of the year look like we're not going to receive a ton of payments, right? And then as time goes along, especially like in 2023, all of a sudden we received a lot of payments, right? So it's not uncommon for a situation like this where it looks like at time of enrollment everything is looks like we're going to have good margins. Why would we want to enroll in the program, right? But more than once, more than 1 year, we've sat at that same point in time, whether it's now after the first year or in the fall, and looked at it and said, hey, we're not showing any payment triggers. Why consider the program? Some have opted not to enroll. Then as we go along, it turns out that we do trigger payments, right? So not saying there's never a guarantee, right? But it's definitely not unheard of for that to happen. So sign up again is April 29th. So make sure you're at your FSA office by then. FSA does have a good website on the dairy margin coverage program. So if you Google it, it'll be in there. Here's the link for the different FSA service centers if you're curious on that. I do want to go through the web tool here just quickly. So that way folks if you do have questions on your individual operation and how you want to do the math, I'd take a look at that. So it's at dmc.dairymarkets.org. One thing I do want to point out is that at the top left corner is where it says select year. Make sure you're selecting the appropriate year. So make sure that that's 2024. And then let's just go through the different kind of fields that you can utilize here to kind of understand how your numbers would be interpreted and input. So if you come to this page, you select the year of 2024. In your annual historic production, you put in your production level, right? So it defaults at 5,000 pounds because that's for tier 1, the maximum amount for tier 1 production. Lower in the screen, you can see that light red, almost pinkish color shows you your tier 1. And that gray second portion there shows you tier 2. Your coverage level, again, we said that goes from 5% to 95%. That's your percent coverage of your total annual historic production. So then if you're above that 5 million pounds, you can still enter it, right? But it will cut off that first 5 million, put that in tier 1. Everything else will go in tier 2. So then after you do all this, it shows you at the top right here, your total coverage, your total premium, and does all the math for you, right? All you have to do is select your coverage level. So again, for tier 1, you have the option of $850, $9, and $950. You have those 3 options or choices for coverage levels that tier 2 doesn't. As we've seen in the numbers, the majority of folks have selected this $9.50 level, which is 15 cents per hundredweight, and $7,123 in premium. So as you can play around with this and add in, you can select your different coverage levels, you can select your different premium levels, and you can kind of see where your total numbers fall. If we take a look at the header across the screen, we just went through the coverage level page. You have your net benefit forecast, your price forecast, historic performance, and finally your milk price payment trigger analysis. So let's just talk net benefit forecast for a moment. So this kind of just shows you, again, when you're doing this, make sure that your year 2024 is selected, and the rest of it should carry through as well. But if you go to the very bottom of the screen here, it shows you what your anticipated net benefit is for the information that you put in, given what the current forecast is, right? So your net benefit right now in this example would be $4,111. If we go to price forecast, this is where the all milk price, your corn price, your hay price, soybean meal, which those things added up, your total feed cost, and your margin, right? So if you're curious what right now the market information is telling us for this program on where our forecast is and where our payment levels are, this is the place to find it. So I'll often use this just as a quick and easy reference as well. I think that there's some good information here, even regularly to check in on, even if you're not specifically just looking for DMC sign up, right? So historic performance, this is where if you're wondering for your operation, what historically enrollment would look like, right? If you hadn't been enrolled previously, or what your, let's say, benefit of being involved has been. I encourage you to take a look at this. So you can choose your start year, your end year, enter in your historic production, and it will show you per year, right, what your payments have been. So what's interesting here is that so this is from 2009 to 2023, just in this example here, and you can see that there's been way more green lines than red lines here in this example. So I think that that's pretty indicative of most operations that have enrolled, especially in that tier 1 level of production. So you can include your tier 2 in this as well. But I do encourage you to take a look, kind of play around with it, and hopefully get some good insights for your operation there. This is the milk price payment trigger analysis. It's the same thing that we just showed before. I showed it graphically in comparison to all milk price, but this is pretty much the same thing. But just show it in a different way. So it just shows us where milk price would have to be in order to trigger payments for the different months. And then you can put your local basis in too, if you're curious. And it takes into account that $9.50 coverage level and feed cost in order to calculate that back out. So some helpful links here if you're interested, but the DMC tool, your local FSA center, and then additional choices for risk management, DRP, LGM dairy, things like that. One nice thing about the DMC program is that quite a few years ago, they made the change that you can still utilize dairy margin coverage while using some of these other tools as well, right? So at one point in time, using DMC excluded you from participating in some of these other products, and it's not the case anymore. So always check with your FSA office first, but that is, one big change that that they were wanting to make, just to make sure that there's still utilizing one risk management tool didn't exclude you from utilizing others. So take a look, check it out. Questions? Anything come up? Otherwise, I do have some other additional information we can go through.
There are currently no questions in there, but if anybody does, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box.
Perfect. So for maybe like 2 or 3 minutes here, I'll kind of go through some of the arguments at the moment as to why to consider right now at this particular point in time utilizing the program, right? So the short answer is that it's really hard to be bullish on price when we have so much production capacity coming online in the US at the moment, right? So between now and 2025, first part of 2026, there's over $7 billion in production slated to come online in dairy processing capacity, right? So with all that additional capacity coming online, when we're already seeing that our demand has been a bit tight, and with exports aren't exactly zooming out of the US the way that we would maybe normally like. I think there's a good enough possibility and a good enough potential that we could see some definite price pressures out there at the moment that could definitely drag on prices. And we've been holding fairly steady here recently. I wouldn't say that we have a resoundingly strong milk price, but we're better than we had been in 2023. But I do think that there's enough pressures out there, both US and internationally at the moment, that to say that we're definitely at the end of if we take a look at our price cycle for dairy, to say that we're definitely out of the bottom, that it's only good news going forward, I think is a tough claim to make. I do think that we're through the price cycle where maybe we aren't going to see as much prolonged low prices if we do get there as we did in 2023. But I do think it's hard to say that it's all sunshine and rainbows and that everything looks absolutely 100% positive as we go forward. So one reason for that is that a lot of these market response that we've seen recently has been on the supply side, right? We've seen cow numbers come down. A report just recently again, our cow numbers keep coming down, but our total production is we're still hanging in there, right? So as that continues, if we're seeing the response on the supply side, but our prices haven't changed a lot, that means that we do need to see some response on our demand side as well. So until we see that response on the demand side and come back fairly strong for a decent period of time, I think it might be a big ask of the market at the moment that it's going to deliver really high prices, especially on that class 3 side, that are going to push us up and hold us at good margins for a prolonged period. So of course you do hope that happens, but at the moment we're just waiting for the market to respond and numbers to come in to say that that'll be the case. So with that, I do think that there's enough unknown and enough uncertainty at the moment to definitely warrant considering signing up. And as always, I hope that I'm wrong, right? I hope that we have a really great year, and that maybe it'd be another 2022. We'll see. But at the moment, I wouldn't bet the ranch on it, right? Because I do think there's enough happening in the market that that could spell otherwise. So I do thank you for joining us here today. Hopefully this was valuable for you. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and thank you, Leonard, for speaking, and thank you everyone for attending, and hope you have a great rest of the day.